He didn't hide in the shadows. He used them. In Buck's Row, in late summer of 1888, the gas lamps were few, the alleyways narrow, and a woman could be turned away from a lodging house for the price of a bed, 4p, and then disappear into the night. Today, we're returning to Whitechapel to ask a simple, painful question. What do we actually know about Jack the Ripper, and why does the name still swallow so many stories about a place and people who were already invisible? Daniel, are you ready to walk back into that fog with me?
Yeah, Eleanor, I'm ready. And it's important we set the scene right away. Whitechapel in 1888 was one of the most densely packed parts of London, with some streets running at more than 1,000 people per acre. Cramped common lodging houses, open sewers, and gaslight that left courts and yards effectively in darkness. Those environmental details matter because they shaped who could be seen and who could be overlooked, especially poor women, migrants, and those doing informal or street-based work.
Right, and when you say overlooked, you mean it in more than a literal sense. The era's moral frame labelled many of these women as fallen, which affected how the police and press treated them. So before we talk about the crimes, can we spend a few minutes on the social map, how the East End functioned as an internal colony of the city?
Absolutely. Think of the East End as a pressure cooker, an influx of rural poor, Irish migrants from earlier in the century, and by the 1880s, a significant number of Eastern European Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms. People packed into rooms, sometimes sleeping in shifts or hotbedding. Work was casual, dock labour, tailoring, match factories. Wages were low and unstable, and a single unpaid day could mean eviction. Add cheap gin and overcrowding, and you've got a social system in which petty crime and desperation were everyday realities.
And the lodging houses, those details always strike listeners. A bed for 4p, and if you didn't have it, you were turned back onto the street. That small economic pressure, 4p, could be the difference between a roof over your head and being exposed at 3 a.m.
Exactly. Those common lodging houses like Wilmot's or the ones on Flower and Dean Street were notorious for overcrowding and rough clientele. Women who used the streets to make money did so precariously. They might sell flowers or hawk trinkets by day and be driven to sex work by a single rent bill. That precarity made them both visible and yet, paradoxically, treated as unworthy of protection.
Let's put faces on the story. I want to spend time with each of the canonical 5, who they were, not only how they died. Start with Mary Ann Polly Nichols for me, Daniel.
Polly Nichols was born Mary Ann Walker in 1845 and for a time had a family, married to William Nichols with 5 children. The marriage broke down around 1880 amid reports of alcoholism and other strains, and from there she cycled through work as a domestic servant, stays in workhouses and nights in common lodging houses. On the night of August 30-31, 1888, she couldn't pay the 4p for a bed and reportedly planned to solicit to raise the money. She was found dead in Buck's Row around 3:45 a.m.
Right. And the crime scene, 2 deep cuts to the throat and abdominal wounds, was brutal, but importantly not yet linked publicly to a series. People at the time saw it as another violent death in a district used to violence.
Yes, the police logged it as a single murder initially. It was only after the next killing, Annie Chapman on September 8th, that investigators and the public began to see a pattern, though even then the conclusions were contested. Speaking of Annie, shall I move on?
Please do. And Daniel, don't just tell us the timeline. Tell us about her life before the headlines.
Annie Chapman was born Annie Eliza Smith in 1841, and for many years she lived a relatively stable, lower-middle-class life, married to John Chapman. His work as a coachman and their family gave them a measure of stability, but both reportedly struggled with alcohol, and John died in 1886. Widowed and unwell, Annie had tuberculosis and other chronic conditions. She declined into destitution and by 1888 was living at Crossingham's lodging house on Dorset Street. On the night of September 7-8, she was turned away for lack of rent, again that fourpence problem, and found shortly after in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street.
Annie's injuries, the throat cut and extensive abdominal mutilation with part of the uterus removed, led some medical observers at the time to speculate about anatomical knowledge. But that's a contested point, right?
Very contested. Some doctors thought the speed and precision suggested knowledge of anatomy. Others countered that a butcher or slaughterman could perform similar cuts. The takeaway is that organ removal triggered a flurry of theories: mad doctor, black market organ trade, many of which were sensational rather than evidence-based.
And then we come to Elizabeth Long Liz Stride and Catherine Kate Eddowes, the so-called double event night. Liz Stride, Swedish origins, some earlier claims about a maritime disaster. Tell listeners about her.
Elizabeth Stride, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter in Sweden in 1843, had worked as a domestic servant and later as a prostitute. She married John Thomas Stride in 1869, and they ran a coffee shop in Poplar for a time, but the marriage fell apart. She had a history of medical treatment for syphilis and drifted in and out of lodging houses on Dorset Street. On the night of September 29-30, she was last seen in Berner Street and found around 1 a.m. in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been cut deeply, but there were no abdominal mutilations.
That lack of mutilation is key. Many investigators thought the killer was interrupted, maybe by people at the International Working Men's Educational Club or by a cart entering the yard, so he fled before completing whatever his usual modus operandi was. But some modern commentators suggest Stride could have been killed by someone else entirely, though most still include her in the canonical 5. Thoughts, Daniel?
It's a debated point. The timing and proximity to Eddowes' murder that same night argue for connection. The absence of mutilation raises the interruption hypothesis. What we can say with confidence is that the night exposed how quickly patterns were inferred, and how those inferences could be both powerful and fragile.
And then Eddowes, Kate Eddowes, whose body was found in Mitre Square not long after Stride, she was released from Bishopsgate Police Station just after 1 a.m, right?
She was. Kate Eddowes had spent the evening seeking money in the city, became intoxicated, and was arrested for drunkenness. She was released after sobering up, reportedly saying she'd give her name and address when she returned, which she never did. She was seen entering Mitre Square with a man around 1:35 a.m. and found at about 1:44 a.m. The mutilations were severe: throat cut, facial mutilation, abdomen opened, intestines placed over the right shoulder, and removal of the left kidney and part of the uterus.
And that night also produced the Golston Street graffito, the line about the Jews that was erased by order of Sir Charles Warren to prevent anti-Semitic riots. That decision itself speaks to the wider social tensions in Whitechapel at the time, doesn't it?
It does. Golston Street sat between Mitre Square and the East End, and a blood-stained portion of Eddowes' apron was found nearby. Above it was chalk writing reading something like, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Accounts vary because the message was erased before thorough documentation. Commissioner Warren ordered it wiped under fears of anti-Semitic violence. Context matters because the East End included a growing Jewish immigrant population who were often scapegoated in the press and public discourse.
So the press and public atmosphere was primed for xenophobia, another reason the investigation could be misdirected. Then the last canonical murder, Mary Jane Kelly in Miller's Court. This one differed in that it took place indoors, in a private room.
Yes, Mary Jane Kelly, likely the youngest of the 5 at around 25 to 30, had a more uncertain identity. Claims to be from Ireland,
periods of better circumstances as a higher-end prostitute, and an on-and-off partner, Joseph Barnett. She lived in a single ground-floor room at 13 Miller's Court off Dorset Street. Found on November 9th around 10:45 a.m., the mutilations were far more extensive than the others. Throat cut to the spine, flaying of abdomen and thighs, internal organs removed and arranged. Reports say the heart was missing. Being indoors gave the killer time and privacy, which likely explains the escalation.
And the burning of items in the grate, the melted solder and stove, is often interpreted as the killer attempting to destroy evidence or as a source of light. Either way, the Miller's Court murder stands out. Daniel, when we step back, what pattern do the 5 canonical victims create?
They form a pattern of late-night or early morning attacks on women who were economically precarious, often intoxicated, and sometimes engaged in sex work. The modus operandi included cutting the throat first and post-mortem abdominal mutilation, with organ removal in several cases. The pattern escalated from Nichols' wounds to Kelly's devastating indoor violence, suggesting either an escalation of confidence or opportunity, and perhaps both. But patterns can be overinterpreted, and the differences, like Stride's absence of mutilation, remind us to be cautious.
Caution is crucial, especially because the press narrative coalesced so quickly around a single figure, the Jack the Ripper brand. Let's talk about the letters that helped manufacture that brand. Daniel, tell us about the flood of correspondence and the Dear Boss letter.
After the murders, hundreds of letters arrived at Scotland Yard and in newspaper offices, many obvious hoaxes. The Dear Boss letter, dated September 25th and received September 27th by the Central News Agency, was a 2-page red ink taunting note signed Jack the Ripper, the first time the name appears. It mocked the police and threatened ear-cutting in the next job. When Catherine Eddowes was found with part of her right earlobe removed, some saw a match between the threat and the crime, which increased the letter's credibility in the public eye. But many officials later thought Dear Boss was a hoax, and in 1931, journalist Fred Best allegedly confessed that he and a colleague at the Star wrote the letter to keep sales high.
And the saucy Jackie postcard followed, referencing the double event. Those communications, along with the press taking them up, created a narrative that turned a series of murders into a single theatrical villain. But then there's the From Hell letter, different in tone and content, and it arrived with a small piece of a human kidney. How do we weigh that one?
From Hell, sent to George Lusk of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee on October 16th, came with a portion of human kidney preserved in alcohol. The writer claimed to have fried and eaten part of it. This letter's handwriting and tone are starkly different from Dear Boss. Some find it more plausible as genuine because a kidney had been removed from Eddowes, and the letter bypassed the police and press to go directly to a local figure. But skeptics note the kidney could have come from a medical student prank or other source, so again we're left with ambiguity.
Ambiguity. There's that theme again. The letters turned a pattern of tragedies into a media spectacle and gave the murderer a name that outlived any concrete evidence. Then the police were hunting not just a killer, but a character created by the press. How did limitations of policing in 1888 compound the problem?
Policing then lacked fingerprinting, DNA, and reliable blood typing. Photography existed, but not for night scenes. Scene preservation was rudimentary. The Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police were separate forces. Jurisdictional differences complicated cooperation, especially when Eddowes was killed in Mitre Square, just inside the city. Superintendent tensions, political pressures, and the heavy workload on beat constables who walked long routes in labyrinthine streets all made thorough investigation difficult. Leaks to the press and competing pet theories within the force also undermined a coherent strategy.
And then the noise of rumours and hoaxes, leather apron, xenophobic scapegoating, false witnesses must have overwhelmed investigators, turning practical leads into distractors. Which brings us to suspects. The everyone and no one problem. There were hundreds of men questioned, but Aaron Kosminski has been the enduring suspect in many modern accounts. Walk us through who he was and why he became central.
Aaron Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant, a barber who lived in the East End, born around 1865. By the early 1890s, he had serious mental health problems, hallucinations, paranoid delusions, and in 1891 he was institutionalized until his death in 1919. Sir Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, senior officials involved in the inquiry and who wrote about the case years later, intimated that a Polish Jew who was mentally ill was their likely suspect, though he wasn't named publicly at the time. Researchers later cross-referenced notes and identified Kosminski as that man. He fits a profile of a local, lower-status figure with proximity to the scenes, but critically, there's no direct contemporaneous evidence linking him to the murders.
No weapon, no eyewitness identification suitable for prosecution, nothing admitted by Kosminski, so his suspect status rests largely on retrospective memoirs and ambiguous notes. Then the modern DNA debate inflamed popular belief that the case could finally be closed. Tell listeners about the shawl controversy.
In 2007, a silk shawl claimed to have come from near Catherine Eddowes' body resurfaced and was bought by amateur ripperologist Russell Edwards. Edwards and molecular biologist Jari Louhelainen later claimed mitochondrial DNA from a descendant of Eddowes and a descendant of Kosminski matched traces on the shawl, which they argued identified Kosminski as the killer. The story made sensational headlines, some outlets saying the case was closed. But the chain of custody for the shawl is shaky. There's no unbroken record proving it was at the original crime scene. The shawl had been handled many times, raising contamination concerns. Mitochondrial DNA is also limited. It ties to a maternal line and can match many individuals. Critics argue the work wasn't peer-reviewed initially, and that the results are suggestive at best, not definitive.
You just touched on something crucial. The hunger for closure can push science and storytelling into overreach. The shawl narrative is a case study in that impulse. Daniel, how have mainstream and tabloid outlets framed these findings?
Popular press outlets, ranging from People to The Sun and the New York Post, have often run headlines claiming certainty which the underlying evidence does not support. The sensational framing sells newspapers and books, but it can mislead the public into thinking a cold case has been solved with finality, when the forensic limitations, the shawl's chain of custody, mDNA constraints, and contamination possibilities make such claims premature. That dynamic repeats throughout ripperology. A strong narrative attracts coverage, and coverage attracts confirmation bias.
Right. And if we accept that the evidence for Kosminski is circumstantial, what do we make of the alternative suspects, Druitt, Tomblety, Sickert, Berry, and the general theory that the killer was a local, ordinary man?
Each candidate has pros and cons. Montague John Druitt, a barrister who died by suicide in December 1888, was later named in a memo by Melville McNagnon as a likely suspect. Some see the coincidence of the murders ending after his death as suggestive, but no concrete evidence places him in Whitechapel at the crucial times. Francis Tumblety, an Irish-American quack doctor, was in London and had unsavoury allegations against him, but timeline and connection to the crimes are debated. Walter Sickert, the artist, was targeted by Patricia Cornwell in a controversial set of books claiming DNA links to Ripper letters. Scholars largely dismiss those claims as weak and speculative. William Henry Bury, who later murdered his wife in Dundee, produced graffiti referencing the Ripper in his flat, but the link remains circumstantial. Many modern profilers suggest a local East End man with easy access to knives or slaughtering tools and a history of violence is actually the most plausible scenario, unremarkable, forgettable, and therefore hard to identify.
So the idea of a dramatic, eccentric villain, a surgeon, an aristocrat, an artist,
can be more compelling than the more mundane truth that the killer could have been an ordinary, violent man from the neighborhood. That's less neat for storytelling, but likely closer to reality. Why then does the mystery persist so strongly?
Several reasons. First, the physical evidence is fragmentary and poorly preserved. We don't have an unbroken chain of custody for primary artifacts. Second, conflicting internal documents and later police memos contradict each other on suspects and motives. Third, there's a cultural feedback loop. Every new book or documentary needs a hero or a villain, a coherent narrative, so authors pick a pet suspect and emphasize selective evidence. Finally, there's a human psychological need for closure. The mind prefers a single answer rather than living with uncertainty.
Which raises an ethical question. Why do we remember the killer's nickname, but not the biographical details of the women who died? For decades, these women were reduced to labels, prostitutes, unfortunates, rather than fully lived lives. How has scholarship shifted in recent years?
Recently, there's been a reclamation of the victims' lives. Historians and public history projects have highlighted their names, backgrounds, and circumstances. Biographical work on Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly emphasizes their prior family connections, work histories, and the day-to-day struggles that made them vulnerable. Memorials, plaques, and more nuanced walking tours now attempt to center them rather than the killer. That shift reframes the story from how clever was the killer to questions about structural poverty, misogyny, and systemic neglect.
And that reframing matters beyond historical justice. There are parallels to contemporary violence against women, murders of sex workers and migrants that are under-investigated or sensationalized. The Ripper case becomes a lens for modern policing and social attitudes. Daniel, in your work on forensic history, you've written about how modern claims of identification sometimes run ahead of the science. What does the Kosminski shawl debate teach us about scientific humility?
It teaches restraint. Forensic tools have advanced dramatically since 1888. DNA, databases, profiling, but those tools can't rescue evidence that was lost, contaminated, or never collected with modern standards. mtDNA, for example, can link a sample to a maternal line, but not necessarily to a unique individual. The Shaw's chain of custody is fragmentary. It was handled by many people. In the rush to say the case is solved, some researchers and journalists downplayed those limits. Science needs peer review, transparency about contamination risk, and careful presentation of probabilities, not headlines of 100% certainty.
So the attraction to neat answers can overshadow methodological caution. Let's take a breath and talk about the double event night again. There's so much that illustrates both investigative possibility and failure. Elizabeth Stride's lack of mutilation, Eddowes' body, and the apron fragment found in Golston Street. What do these scenes tell us about how evidence moved and was handled?
They show both the constraints of the environment and the investigative standards of the time. The Golston Street apron fragment was found some distance from Mitre Square, but heavy foot traffic, poor scene security, and the haste to remove and move bodies complicated things. The graffito above the fragment was erased on Warren's orders to prevent anti-Semitic riots, which prevented later analysis. Bodies were often moved quickly, and bystanders handled items. The absence of later secure evidence, no murder weapon, no unambiguous blood-stained clothing preserved under modern protocols, left investigators with mostly witness statements and medical testimony that conflicted in details.
And medical testimony itself was inconsistent. Some doctors saw anatomical skill, others saw the work of someone used to cutting meat. That range of opinions probably made it harder to build a focused profile. Daniel, you mentioned earlier the policing jurisdictions, Metropolitan versus City of London. Can you say more about how that split played out in practice during the investigation?
Sure. The Metropolitan Police covered Whitechapel, but Mitre Square, where Eddowes was found, fell under the City of London Police. When a crime crosses jurisdictions, cooperation depends on goodwill and clear communication. In 1888, those relationships were sometimes tense. Officers protected their reputations, and senior figures like Sir Charles Warren faced political pressures that influenced decisions, such as erasing the graffito to avoid unrest. Those bureaucratic frictions, combined with the public furor, made a coordinated, methodical response difficult.
Which circles back to why the investigation unravelled. Environmental limits, victim marginalisation, lack of physical evidence, press distortions, and internal police politics. A perfect storm, really. But I want to press you on one more thing. Why did the canonical series stop after Mary Jane Kelly? There are a number of theories. Death, imprisonment, emigration, or the killer simply changing tactics. What's your read?
We can't know for certain, but there are plausible scenarios. The killer could have died, been institutionalized for another offense, left the country, or ceased attacking women in ways that matched the press's pattern, so later murders, if any, slipped back into the background of everyday violence. Another possibility is that the intense public attention made it too dangerous for him to continue. Historically, investigators have speculated about each option, but the absence of continued identical murders after Kelly suggests either a decisive ending of the killer's activity or a change that rendered subsequent crimes less visible or less linked.
Which returns us to a key theme for this episode, the danger of neat answers. Pinning the series on a single man with thin evidence provides narrative comfort, but may sacrifice truth. So where does that leave us as historians and public scholars? How do we responsibly tell the story?
By centering the victims and the social context, being candid about evidentiary limits, and resisting sensationalism. That means acknowledging the many uncertainties, the letter's authenticity, the suspect list's weaknesses, the forensic claim's limits. It also means asking structural questions, how poverty, misogyny, and policing practices made these women vulnerable. Honesty about what we don't know is critical. Sometimes still unanswered is the only responsible verdict.
Well said. Now, I want to take a minute to address the cultural afterlife of Jack the Ripper. Over the last 130 years, the Ripper has become a symbol, a stock villain in fiction, the origin myth of the serial killer, a tourist industry. How has that cultural packaging affected public memory of the crimes?
It's had a distorting effect. Jack the Ripper as a character functions as shorthand for an unnameable evil which can eclipse the reality, 5 women with names and histories. The media's appetite for plot and personality and identifiable killer creates a feedback loop of books, films, and tours that prioritize spectacle. That not only transforms the victims into props for entertainment, but also simplifies the complex social causes that made such crimes possible.
And that brings us to ethics. Tours and gore-heavy portrayals risk re-victimizing people who already suffered neglect. On the other hand, some public history efforts have tried to correct that, focusing on victims' lives. Which memory work do you find most responsible or effective?
Efforts that restore individuality to the victims, biographical essays, plaques, memorial services, and tours that emphasize social history rather than lurid detail are the most responsible. Projects that contextualize the murders within larger issues of poverty and institutional failure help audiences understand why these women were at risk and why systemic reform matters. That's preferable to spectacle that sensationalizes violence for entertainment.
And Daniel, quick personal question. Do you think modern forensics, if applied perfectly in 1888, would have caught the Ripper? Imagining a time machine here.
Hypothetically, yes. If we assume ideal preservation of evidence, rapid DNA analysis, fingerprint databases, CCTV, and coordinated policing, a suspect could have been identified far sooner. But that's a big if. The real world is messier.
Evidence was not preserved to modern standards, and social structures and technologies were different. So while modern forensics can solve many things, it can't retroactively reconstruct vanished chains of custody.
Good point. Let's wrap by returning to the 5 women, Polly, Annie, Liz, Kate, and Mary Jane, and the question I keep coming back to: why do we remember the killer's nickname, but not the women's stories? How do we, as historians, shift that balance?
We shift it by telling the victims' stories first, by treating their lives as worthy of study beyond their deaths. That means using archival records, workhouse registers, lodging house logs, newspaper accounts, with sensitivity, and publishing narratives that restore their names and relationships. It also means interrogating the social systems, housing, policing, labor markets, that made violence more likely. When scholarship and public history prioritize the victims, the public narrative starts to change.
I want to end on a line from our series title, Still Unanswered. It's uncomfortable, but it's honest. The evidence we have simply doesn't support a courtroom verdict for any single man, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to history and to the victims. Daniel, any final thought you want to leave listeners with?
Yes, remember this. Fascination with a legend can obscure structural realities. The story of Jack the Ripper should spur curiosity about how we treat vulnerable people today. If the only thing we take from these cases is morbid intrigue, we fail. If instead we use the mystery to ask how systems failed these women and how they fail people now, then the story has a possible redemptive value.
Powerful. Thank you, Daniel. Before we go, quick lightning round. 3 short questions. 1-word answers, okay. Ready?
Ready.
Who is the most plausible suspect, in 1 word?
Kosminski. Circumstantially.
Single worst mistake investigators made.
Poor evidence preservation.
Single best corrective for public memory.
Victim-centered history.
Perfect. Listeners, if you want more reading, the sources we leaned on include classic Ripper overviews and recent write-ups on the shawl controversy, links in the episode notes. But the responsible takeaway is simple. The Ripper legend endures, and our job is to refuse the easy glamour of mystery when it erases the lives at the centre. Daniel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Eleanor. It's been important to take the long view. Historical humility is underrated. And listeners, keep questioning what stories are sold to you as solved.